Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Wednesday, March 20th. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, Asa Winstanley, Jon Elmer, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 166 of Israel's genocide in Gaza. We have another packed show for you today, including interviews with legendary historian Ilan Pappé and physician Ben Thomson. And later on in the program, a full roundup of videos from the Palestinian armed resistance and a look at the U.S. Army's operation to build a pier in Gaza City with Jon Elmer. But first, some of the news that we've been covering at the Electronic Intifada. The Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza is reporting that the official number of Palestinians killed by Israel since October 7th is now approximately 32,000, with 74,000 injured and thousands more missing and buried under the rubble. Israeli soldiers invaded and besieged the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City at dawn on Monday, the fourth time that the largest medical facility in the Gaza Strip was attacked since November. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza, Israeli forces bombed the specialized surgeries building, setting it ablaze. Approximately 30,000 displaced Palestinians who have been sheltering at the medical complex were trapped. Israeli airstrikes targeted people in residential areas as they tried to escape the incursion, while soldiers ordered them to flee to the south. This video was captured on Monday, showing a young boy holding a car seat in the Shifa Hospital neighborhood saying, quote, "I swear to God, I'm scared. I cannot take this anymore. I swear, I just want to go." That was from Monday. Israeli snipers and armed quadcopters inside the hospital shot those who tried to move, the health ministry reported. At least 150 Palestinians were arrested. During the raid on Al-Shifa, Israeli forces assassinated Faik al-Mahbou, the commander of Gaza's civilian police unit. Al-Mahbou had led recent coordination efforts to deliver humanitarian aid to the northern Gaza Strip, which Israel has been actively thwarting for months as its snipers and tank gunners repeatedly massacre Palestinians awaiting the deliveries. Some Twitter users remarked that the assassination of al-Mahbou was in retaliation for his successful coordination of the shipment of flour. Echoing their previous and unfounded claims to justify the bombing of Al-Shifa hospital, the Israeli army claimed that al-Mahbou was a, quote, senior Hamas operative who was hiding inside Al-Shifa hospital complex, quote, from which he was working to advance terror activity, according to the Times of Israel. Al Jazeera Arabic reporter Ismail Al-Ghul was arrested and kidnapped by Israeli forces during Monday's raid, along with other journalists. He was released 12 hours later. While he was detained, he said he and the other journalists were beaten, stripped naked, blindfolded, and interrogated. For more, read my article, Israel Besieges, Storms Al-Shifa Hospital on electronicintifada.net. The Israeli army boasted about its invasion and siege on Al-Shifa hospital on Tuesday, saying they killed at least 50 Palestinians who they labeled as, quote, terrorists, and claiming that they avoided harming civilians, hospital staff, and medical equipment. But of course, that claim was contradicted by photos, videos, and eyewitness accounts. Motassim Dalul, a journalist in Gaza, reported that a young man released from detention at Al-Shifa hospital testified that displaced persons, patients, and paramedics were detained by Israeli forces who divided them into three categories: execution, detention, and deportation to the south of Gaza. Gaza's government media office reported on Tuesday that, quote, hundreds of Israeli occupation soldiers, heavily armed and accompanied by police dogs, tanks, drones, and helicopters, participated in the raid on Al-Shifa Medical Complex. They fired heavily inside the medical compound at patients, displaced persons, and civilians, resulting in the death and injury of more than 250. They also set fire to some facilities inside the hospital. Also on Tuesday, Israeli airstrikes targeted residential blocks inside Nuseirat refugee camp in central Gaza. Amongst the at least 15 killed was another police chief in charge of local distribution of humanitarian aid, Mahmoud Bayoumi. Following the assassination on Monday of Faik al-Mahbou, the commander of the police unit in charge of humanitarian aid coordination efforts, Israeli forces again targeted another member of the Palestinian police force on Tuesday. Quds News Network reported that Raed al-Banna, the director of police investigations in the northern Gaza province, was killed along with his wife and children in an Israeli airstrike targeting their home. Al-Banna was responsible for securing and facilitating the entry of aid trucks to northern Gaza, the network reported. And last night, Israeli forces assassinated Amjad Hattat, the director of the Emergency Committee in Western Gaza, who was in charge of coordinating the transfer of food aid from the Israeli checkpoint to UN warehouses. The government media office in Gaza says that more than 100 aid workers have been killed and dozens wounded over the past week in 8 separate attacks carried out by Israeli forces. In a statement, the media office said that these attacks on aid workers are intended to, quote, perpetuate the policy of starvation and deepen famine on a broader scale. On Tuesday, Israel targeted Palestinians awaiting an aid convoy in Gaza City, killing dozens, including members of the civil aid security teams, in what has now become a daily occurrence. And last night in Jabalia refugee camp, a food distribution center was also targeted and destroyed by Israeli forces. Palestinian children are continuing to bear the brunt of Israel's starvation policy. Mohamed al-Najjar succumbed to dehydration and malnutrition on Tuesday at the European hospital in Khan Yunis, reported Quds News Network. Catherine Russell, the executive director of the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, said last Friday that, quote, the speed at which this catastrophic child malnutrition crisis in Gaza has unfolded is shocking, especially when desperately needed assistance has been at the ready just a few miles away. Al Jazeera reported that on Monday, Israel officially asked the International Court of Justice not to issue emergency orders for it to step up humanitarian aid to Gaza to address a looming famine, dismissing South Africa's request to do so as, quote, morally repugnant. Lawyers for Israel, Al Jazeera added, quote, denied allegations of deliberately causing humanitarian suffering in the besieged enclave, where tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed and hunger is rising. They said South Africa's repeated requests for additional measures are an abuse of procedures. The international human rights charity Oxfam released a report on Monday slamming the Israeli government and its Western enablers for, quote, failing in its legal responsibilities to the people whose land it occupies and breaking one of the key provisions demanded by the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, to boost humanitarian aid in light of the risk of genocide in Gaza. Oxfam's report, titled Inflicting Unprecedented Suffering and Destruction, 7 Ways the Government of Israel is Deliberately Blocking and or Undermining the International Humanitarian Response in the Gaza Strip, identifies how Israel actively prevents the delivery of international aid into Gaza, quote, punishing all Palestinians living in Gaza by deliberately depriving them of life and safety. Excuse me. The group's Middle East and North Africa director, Sally Abi Khalil, stated, quote, the ICJ order should have shocked Israeli leaders to change course, but since then, conditions in Gaza have actually worsened. The fact that other governments have not challenged Israel hard enough, but instead turned to less effective methods like airdrops and maritime corridors is a huge red flag, signaling that Israel continues to deny the full potential of better ways to deliver more aid. Oxfam stressed that other states are obligated to, quote, take all diplomatic, economic, and political actions necessary to prevent genocide in Gaza, to enable more aid, and to prevent the possibility of Palestinians being forcibly displaced outside of Gaza. States should discontinue their arms sales and other forms of security assistance that would facilitate the risk of genocide and ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity by Israel upon Gaza, Oxfam said. That report was published at the same time that an update on starvation in Gaza was released by the UN-backed Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, and its Famine Review Committee. The IPC announced that according to its most recent and available data, 1.1 million people in Gaza, half the population, quote, have completely exhausted their food supplies and coping capacities and are struggling with catastrophic hunger and starvation, which is IPC Phase 5. This is the highest number of people ever recorded as facing catastrophic hunger by the IPC system, and double the number in IPC Phase 5 just 3 months ago. The report adds that approximately 200,000 people in Gaza City and North Gaza governorates are imminently at risk of famine between now and May. The World Food Programme noted that at least 300 trucks per day would be needed to enter Gaza at the bare minimum, especially in the north, to address the immediate food insecurity. The World Food Programme said it has only managed to take 9 convoys to the north since the start of the year. Senior Hamas official Sami Abu Zuhri, speaking to Reuters on Tuesday about the IPC report, said that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was, quote, defying the world and pursuing the killing of the Palestinian people in Gaza by bombs and starvation. U.S. authorities did not immediately respond to a request for comment, Reuters added. But as Aaron Mate pointed out on Twitter, last week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken boasted that, quote, the Israelis have been not only allowing food in, but also working to make sure it gets in and gets to people who need it. He then took credit for, quote, doing everything possible to maximize aid into Gaza. Today, he admits that 100% of the population in Gaza is at severe levels of acute food insecurity. We'll have more discussions about Israel's deepening policies of starvation as Western countries continue to drop meager amounts of aid by plane, facilitated by Jordan, while thousands of trucks remain blocked at the various ground crossings. And we'll talk about the U.S. Army's role in building a pier on the Gaza coast later on in the program. But for now, that's just some of the news from on the ground in Palestine over the last few days. Please go to electronicintifada.net to read some of our important new features by writers in Gaza, now up on our homepage. And you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman. Coming up, we'll have an interview with physician Ben Thomson, and we'll get a full update from Jon Elmer on the latest military developments in Gaza. But first, Ali, please introduce our first guest.
Thanks so much, Nora. It was so difficult to listen to a lot of that news, but thank you for that very thorough summary. I'm really delighted to introduce Ilan Pappé. He's a professor of history at the University of Exeter in the UK and director of the European Centre for Palestine Studies. Many of you will know that Ilan gained renown as one of the new historians, a group of Israeli scholars who in the 1980s shattered long-standing Zionist lies about the founding of Israel and corroborated what Palestinians had been saying all along about the ethnic cleansing and massacres that they survived during the Nakba in 1948. He's the author of many, many books, far too many to mention here, but 2 of them are A History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples, and The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Ilan is also a regular contributor to the Electronic Intifada. He is, of course, a distinguished scholar, but he's also been a prominent and long-time advocate and voice for the liberation of Palestine from Zionism. And I hope I can also say that I consider Ilan to be a very dear friend as well. Welcome, Ilan.
Hello, Ali, and everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor to be on the live stream with the Electronic Intifada, and thank you for your kind introduction.
Thank you, Ilan. First, let me just ask you how you're doing. We're all now, it's more than 5 months of this genocide, almost 6. And I just want to ask you how you're doing.
It's very difficult. I find it difficult to concentrate on my regular work. I find it difficult to sleep. I'm fully aware of what goes on. It's heartbreaking. It's infuriating. And all one can do is double or triple our efforts, first of all, to stop the genocide, but continue also the long strategic aim of liberating Palestine. So, personally, of course, all of us are preoccupied with this. We are not suffering as the people of Gaza do, but I'm definitely feel the pain, and this is for me, and I'm 70 years old this year, is the worst period I experienced personally in the history of modern Palestine.
I know that we all feel very similar. Ilan, we're going to discuss a lot of the issues you raised, but first I want to remind you, I'm sure you haven't forgotten, that in 2006, you wrote for the Electronic Intifada, and I quote, "A genocide is taking place in Gaza." You described this later as an incremental genocide, but 18 years ago, you wrote these words: "Nothing apart from pressure in the form of sanctions, boycott, and divestment will stop the murdering of innocent civilians in the Gaza Strip. There is nothing we here in Israel can do against it. Brave pilots refused to take part in the operations. 2 journalists out of 150 do not cease to write about it, but this is it. In the name of the Holocaust memory, let us hope the world will not allow the genocide in Gaza to continue." You wrote that in 2006. Clearly, there is nothing incremental about the genocide today. Given your clarity about where Israel was headed back then, are you surprised by the savagery and brutality that Israel is perpetrating today?
I must say that although I did expect a very brutal and ruthless Israeli reaction to the operation of the Hamas on October the 7th, I did not foresee them such a magnitude of inhumanity and such a level of criminality and dehumanization as Israel has inflicted on the people of Gaza. I mean, I did anticipate a very ruthless and violent reaction, but I must say that this is beyond anything I could imagine. And I think you're absolutely right. Whereas I think the years of siege were incremental genocide in the sense of creating conditions which were uninhabitable for people in Gaza. This is a genocide that is taking place in front of our eyes on a daily basis. It's nothing incremental about it, and it's really a vicious, intentional attempt to use the 7th of October as a pretext to deal with what Israel has been unable to deal with, which is the presence of nearly 2 million Palestinians in this part of historical Palestine. And they seem to think that they have now an historical opportunity, and there is no moral inhibition in implementing the idea of removing Gaza or, wiping out or erasing Gaza, the Strip, not just the city, the Strip as a whole, from the map of Palestine.
Ilan, you have a unique perspective as an Israeli who's completely rejected Zionism, and yet Israel is the society you grew up in. Tell us about what you see happening inside Israel 48 today. What are the political and social realities that have brought us to this point where seemingly an entire society is united around the goal of the extermination of a people they've already, for 80 years, a century, subjected to dispossession, occupation, apartheid, and persecution?
In 1999, I wrote an article for the Journal of Palestine Studies examining the Israeli educational system, cultural system, and political system. And I argued in that article in 1999 that the next generations of Israelis who will go through the official Israeli educational system, through the socialization in the army, through the media indoctrination, would become even worse than the early Zionist settlers, become a group of supremacist, racist, a group of people that would inflict disasters not only on historical Palestine, but also in the area around Palestine. I'm afraid I was totally correct in this assessment, and this was based on, analyzing the content of the textbook, the curricula, and the basic messages that young Israeli Jews were getting through the various socialization systems in Israel. So what we see now, namely the fact that more than 97% of the Israelis support the genocide in Gaza, is not surprising, unfortunately. It's a society that is used to dehumanize the Palestinians ever since it set foot in Palestine in the late 19th century, in particular when its leaders committed the ethnic cleansing of 1948. You cannot massively kill people. You cannot be totally indifferent to the death of babies, for babies operated without anesthetics, to children burying children, and for your own army committing one war crime after the other, unless you totally dehumanize the victims of these kinds of policies. And dehumanization doesn't come easily to people, contrary to what people think. You need to work on it. You need to socialize people. You need to indoctrinate them to such a level. But this is a fact now. And the fact is that, of course, there are Israeli individuals who are not like that, thank God. There are not all of them like that, but the vast majority are. And this includes the soldiers in the Gaza Strip, the generals, the pundits who comment in the Israeli media about the actions, not to mention, of course, the political leaders. And therefore, we come back to the point we already I made before, that don't expect for a change within Israel to occur in order, if you are wishing, like all of us should wish, for these terrible crimes against the Palestinians to cease. If you really want to stop genocide, and let's not forget the killing of 400 people in the West Bank, if you really want to stop these policies now and those that Israel is planning in the future, the only way is a pressure from the outside. There are moments in history where you cannot rely on a rogue state to change from within, and it has to be pressured to change. And there are the means of doing it, as we have seen in the case of apartheid South Africa and similar cases in history.
We're definitely going to talk about that, but we want to take advantage of your deep knowledge and scholarship and go back to some more historical context. Some 80% of the population in Gaza are refugees from cities, towns, and villages that are now part of Israel, the 1948 areas, including the lands where some of the kibbutzes that were raided on the 7th of October have been built. Talk to us about the history of the so-called Gaza envelope, of the people in Gaza, and what Israel's policy towards them has been.
Yes, I think it's a very important point, Ali, because people may think that there always was a Gaza Strip. Before 1948, there was no Gaza Strip. There was a town called Gaza and small and large villages around it. On the road, the Via Maris, the main road on the Mediterranean between Alexandria in Egypt and Alexandretta in Turkey. It was a very pastoral place. and very cosmopolitical because so many people were using the road and going through Gaza. It had all three religions were represented in the town of Gaza: the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews, and it was quite a beautiful spot in historical Palestine. When Israel began its ethnic cleansing, it was trying to massively move people outside the borders of what became the state of Israel. So people were moved, Palestinians were moved to the north, to Lebanon and Syria, and to the east, to Jordan. However, the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were removed and pushed by force from the center and south of Palestine were directed towards Egypt, but Egypt was unwilling to accept the Palestinian refugees. So the Israeli leaders decided to concede, in inverted commas, 2% of Palestine, although they had the power to occupy it, and create this rectangle that became the Strip as a receptor for all these hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that they have expelled from the central and south of Palestine. Now, the last wave of expulsion was exactly from those villages on whose ruins some of the settlements that were attacked on the 7th of October were built. We have in the Israeli archive a document from the 25th of November, 1948, called Order Number 40, which is sent from the Central Command to the commanders in the area that today would be called the area around Gaza. And it lists 11 villages, and the order is to burn them and expel the people from them to Gaza. On the ruins of these villages, the settlements were built. So what you have in Gaza is a second and a third generation of people who were not just removed forcefully from the rest of Palestine, but also people who are direct descendants of the people who were expelled from the villages on which the kibbutzim and development towns were built around the present Gaza Strip.
And also, Ilan, talk about, and by the way, a couple of weeks ago, we spoke about a story I'd written with David Sheen, which focused on, I think it was Kibbutz Nir Oz, which is one of several kibbutzes built on the land of Al-Ma'in, a Palestinian community, which was largely the home of members of the Abu Sittah family, including Salman Abu Sittah, who has written himself about what he witnessed in 1948 as a child. And the land of Al-Ma'in and the Abu Sittah family is now where several of these kibbutzes sit. Talk to us also about the city of Al-Majda, Al-Asqalan, which is now Ashkelon, because I think many people know that most of the Palestinians were expelled in 1948, starting in 1947, in 1948. But the expulsions did not stop after 1948, after the establishment of the State of Israel. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. And it was not out of a strategic decision because of technical issues that had to do with some problem of coordination in the Israeli army. The thousands of people who lived in Majd al-Asqalan were not expelled in 1948, and they were instead enclaved in an area which the Israeli military governors themselves called the ghetto. And in the ghetto, in Majd al-Asqalan, in the ghetto, most of the population of Majd al-Asqalan lived between 1948 until 1950. And while they were living in those enclaves, the Israeli Jewish city of Ashkelon was built around them. In 1950, it was the Israeli army decided to, or it was rather a political decision by the government led by David Ben-Gurion, that this is not a very healthy situation for the new immigrants who were sent to Ashkelon, many of them coming from Arab countries, and there was always a worry that the Arab Jews and the Palestinians might find a common conversation, a common basis for a dialogue, and so on. So it was decided to forcefully add them to the people who were already refugees in the Gaza Strip, and because this is 1950, and there's already new reporters, Israeli reporters and other reporters, we have quite an extensive documentation on the very process of the expulsion, namely the fact that people were shot above their heads to make sure that they leave. Ironically, Israel was expelling thousands of people who were regarded as citizens of Israel, according to the Independence Declaration of the State of Israel, boasting equality for everyone. And the only reason that they were expelled was that they were Palestinians. And that is important. And as you rightly say, this did not only happen in Ascalon, in Majd al-Ascalon. Between 1948 and 1967, and especially in the first 10 years of Israel's statehood, dozens of Palestinian villages were emptied by force by the Israeli army on the borders with Lebanon, Jordan, and expelled to the other side of the border.
You mentioned, Ilan, that many of the people that Israel moved into the former lands and homes of the Palestinians around what is now the Gaza Strip were Arab Jews. Talk about that. Why did they send Arab Jews to those areas? And what role did Arab Jews play in the establishment of Israel?
Yeah. Israel, the Zionist movement original impulse was to create a European Jewish state on the ruins of Palestine. And until 1948, the Zionist leadership showed very little interest in the Jewish communities in the Arab world for two reasons. One, these communities did not suffer from anti-Semitism, and therefore there was no impulse in those communities compared to the communities in Central and Eastern Europe in particular, to leave a place where they lived for hundreds, and in the case of Iraq, thousands of years. So that's one reason that it was not easy to induce them anyway to come. And secondly, until 1948, they were regarded as Arabs, and therefore there was no wish by the European Zionist leadership to Arabize the Zionist project, so to speak. However, after the Holocaust and the loss of 6 million Jews in Europe, and the fact that a lot of Jewish survivors from the Holocaust did not choose Israel as a destination, and prefer to go to England, the United States, or even go back to some of the European countries from which they originally came, there was a demographic need, or Israel wanted a demographic injunction to increase the number of Jews in Israel. And there, after 1948, Israel began a massive campaign to try and persuade the Jews from Arab countries to come to Israel. They use all kinds of methods, different ones. We don't have time, and maybe one day we can have a deeper conversation about it. But I will just give two examples to show how different communities had to be approached differently by Israel. In Yemen, where the community was far more religious, they spread the ideas and lied to the Jews of Yemen that Israel is a very theocratic religious place where Jews can practice Judaism, which of course was not the case in 1948. And in Iraq, they planted bombs in Iraqi synagogues in order to persuade the Jews to come to Israel. However, after they all came, about 1 million of them, they were still regarded by the Zionist leadership as Arabs. So they had to be de-Arabized. And there were several methods that were used to de-Arabize them. One was to locate them on the geographical margins of the state, near the boundaries with the Arab states, where it was very clear that these were very active borders in terms of frictions and clashes. And that would, the hope was that it would increase their animosity towards the Arabs in general. Another way of doing it was to force them to change their names, to be totally alien to their roots and language, and so on. unfortunately, even without that indoctrination, many, and especially this is particularly true about the North African Jews, they felt that the best way to be initiated or to be accepted as equals in the Israeli European Jewish society was to show animosity and hatred towards the Arabs in general and towards the Palestinians in particular. And that is why the right-wing parties in Israel, the more fascist parties and the more extreme ones, can rely on, especially North African Jews, to provide with them the electoral force in national elections. So they were used, they are victims, as Ella Shochad rightly says, they're also victims of Zionism. However, as can happen in societies, they, instead of directing their anger and their outrage towards the people who really victimized them, they thought that it's easier to direct it towards the Palestinians who had nothing to do with their suffering, with their uprootedness and a lack of equality within the Israeli Jewish society.
Ilan, I want to talk a little bit more about the kind of strategic location of these kibbutzim in the so-called Gaza envelope area, and how the Israeli state has used these colonial settlements as kind of, ramparts for, military surveillance of the Gaza Strip. Can you talk a little bit about the strategy of Israeli policy of placing these seemingly innocuous, farmland, sort of they were branded as like a socialist utopia, these kibbutzes, but what intention was there in building them so close to what's now the Gaza Strip?
Well, this is typical of settler colonial movements. The settler colonial project is a structure; it never stops, and it has to occupy a land that belongs to indigenous people and occupy it again and again, because there's always a risk that the indigenous people would not sit peacefully when they are dispossessed from their land. So what happens is that you totally militarize the civil space. So any settlement, especially on the borderline between areas that have already been colonized and areas that haven't been yet colonized, those who sit on the border, on the one hand, they are civilians and they lead civic life, but on the other hand, they are also soldiers, they are also military, and therefore they carry guns and they are functioning as outposts in a military sense towards the so-called enemy. So I think that they play a very important role in the colonization. First of all, historically, they played a very important role in the colonization. And of course, they play a contemporary role in policing the millions of Palestinians. In between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, there are millions of Palestinians, and Israel polices them in different ways. It uses the Jewish settlements in the West Bank in a similar way to be part of the policing of the oppressive metrics of power, alongside military bases, alongside the secret service operation, and unfortunately also with collaboration with the Palestinian Authority in some places. And inside Israel, they're using the Jewish settlements in the Galilee and in the Nakab in a very similar way. So, they tried to do it in Gaza as well until 2005, but because Gaza doesn't mean much biblically, they couldn't get a large number of Jews to settle in Gaza itself. And that's when Sharon said it's much better to take them out and create this huge prison called Gaza and attack it from the outside without worrying of the fate of the settlers in the inside. If you think about it, the Hamas in many ways enabled us to go back to that situation where this pharmaceutical Israeli idea that Gaza can be totally disassociated from Israel and only be attacked without any danger to Israel. The Hamas always challenged that, first with the Hamas, with the rockets, and now with this particular operation. So I think, yes, it's a kind of a reality where probably best described as Israel being an army with a state rather than a state with an army.
Ilan, we could talk about, the history and the context is so important to understanding the present day because, Israel and its supporters want us to believe history started on October 7th. And that's always, history starts from whatever moment is most suitable to those powerful and to the oppressors. But you were so prescient all those years ago when you wrote about genocide in Gaza, and it wasn't a word that anyone used lightly about Israel's actions. It was almost unimaginable at that time to think that the International Court of Justice could be considering a case very seriously as to whether Israel is perpetrating genocide, and they've already found that it is a plausible case and ordered Israel to stop all genocidal acts, which of course Israel hasn't done. I want to ask you, thinking about the situation in Israel, where do you see things heading? What will it take to stop this genocide? What can pierce this fanaticism of this Israeli population? You alluded to that earlier, but I want you to explore that more.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I'm afraid that we have to, as painful as it is, distinguish between the very near future and the more distant future. I'm afraid that in the near future, although it seems that Israel is acting in such a way that we begin to see actions like the Canadian government's decision to stop suspend arms supplies to Israel and so on, that, in terms of the BDS movement, we are beginning to see the sanctions, and not just the boycott and divestment. But as we can notice, first of all, it's incremental, it's piecemeal, and we don't even know whether it's really happening. Not that I'm underestimating the symbolic force of that. So I think it might have an accumulative impact on Israel, but knowing the Israeli society, it would have to be far more severe, far more direct, far more transparent that this is really happening. And it has to do with the treatment of Israeli sports teams in the world, music, arms sales, and so on. And whereas maybe the global south would move a bit quicker, I think, towards that kind of action, I'm afraid that the global north would take far more time, not to mention the United States, and God knows what the American elections would mean for that kind of action. So I'm afraid, if I'm very honest, if I'm bitterly honest, I cannot see an effective international action within a year or year and a half. I can see it later on. But by the way, I don't want to sound as if I would raise my hands and say there's nothing we can do because of that. No, I'm just saying that if we cannot be observers and think that this is a dynamics that happen by themselves. It means every one of us who is involved in this should double and triple their efforts, and not kind of take for granted that the ICJ and later the ICC or other organization are strong enough at this moment in time to force Israel. There's also another problem with Israel. it can seem to accept certain things, and then it does them incrementally, does them, in a different way. But from the Palestinians' victims' point of view, it's the same kind of thing. So I wish I had a successful formula for the next year or so. I see that the resistance continues. I think that we should pay attention to a possible more severe resistance in the West Bank. We don't yet know what will happen in the north of Israel or Palestine, but I think we have to take into account that you do not stop such a criminal act in one day. And it's terrible to say it because I know what it means on a daily basis, but I want to be brutally realistic here and not, not promise something that isn't. But if I may, I do really believe, and this I say as a scholar, not just as an activist, I really see, and I said it before, and I'm going to say it again in every stage. As a scholar, I can see clear indications that the Zionist project is entering its last phase. It's the beginning of the end of this project. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable from from looking at it from the inside the Jewish society. It's imploding from the inside. There is no cement that holds the various groups in Israel together. It's not sustainable because I think young Jews all over the world would stop equating Zionism with Judaism. It's not sustainable because the Palestinian younger generation have a much better vision and ideas of how to push forward the liberation struggle. And it's not sustainable because of Israel's economic problems and the possibilities of changes in the region, and definitely in the way the international community treats Israel as a pariah state. However, these processes will take more time, but they will happen. So there is a kind of a dawn after this dark night, but I would be irresponsible if I would say that I know exactly how to end this night, terrible period today. But I do want to beseech anyone who's listening to us. It's working in a sense that you cannot see the full picture, but it works if it's relentless, if it doesn't stop, if everything we are doing is done 24/7 as much as we can, because I do think the more accumulative the impact is, the shorter the period in which Israel finally would be held to be accountable and maybe begin to pay the price that apartheid South Africa paid during the beginning of the sanctions when they started. The civil society actions of boycott and divestment are very important, but I think that we need to find a way of moving, as I said, between the B and D to the S. I think that's a very crucial idea. And if I may add to this, of course, we're still looking desperately at the Arab world and the Muslim world to do much, much more. And they really can do much more than they have done so far, without going into the domestic issues of their politics. Even with the current regimes that are there, I don't think they have exhausted their possibilities of lending an effective hand to the overall efforts in the world to stop the genocide as soon as possible.
So, Ilan, you said that Israel is imploding in a way. The Zionist project is imploding. What does that mean? Do you think we can look forward 10, 20 years and say that Israel would still be there, or Israel might be gone? I mean, at what, I know that nobody can put a date on it, but where does this process of implosion lead in your view?
Yeah, I think what we can see quite clearly is a takeover of Israel by the more theocratic, more extreme group of Israelis, whom I called in one of my last pieces the state of Judea, the state of the settlers. It takes over the state of Israel. I mean, both the state of Israel, which is the more liberal Zionist side, and the theocratic, messianic Jewish side, the state of Judea, both of them, of course, believe in the apartheid system and occupation and colonization of Palestine, but they have different view of what the Israeli Jewish society should look from the inside. And I think all those Israelis who still think that they can uphold apartheid alongside a multi-cultural society, an open society, a liberal society, are losing very quickly their political power. They already are absent from the higher echelons of the Secret Service, of the Mossad, of the army, of the important political junctures where policies are taking place. Now, this kind of Israel, the Judea Israel, if you want, find it even more and more difficult. They don't even believe it's important to have international legitimacy, but they would find it more and more difficult to get this legitimacy, which means a lot of other people would leave, would not want to stay, regardless of the situation with the Palestinians. It's just not the kind of place they want. And if they have the money, if they have the passports, if they have the profession that can relocate them and their capitals outside, they will do it. So I can see a drain of a certain group of Israelis who are the elite, and who pay 80% of the Israeli taxes outside of Israel, and so I think it's a process of collapse that I cannot exactly predict how it would look at the end of the collapse, but I can definitely point to the cracks in the building, if you want, and they're getting wider and wider. The one thing I would just like to add is that when such a structure collapses or even weakens to such a level, it creates a void. And if the Palestinian national movement is not there to fill the void, this is a chaos that can continue. So it's not always an assured formula for building something new, unless there is, a preparedness for that kind of historical reality unfolding. But I do believe that this is not. It's not sustainable. It's not working anymore.
Do you see?
Yeah.
Just to ask you, do you see in terms of? I assume you closely observe the Israeli press and media, and of course you have still connections to a country you were born in. Do you see Israelis talking about this among themselves? Is this? It's a common thing for people to say, "Oh, a lot of Israelis have second passports," which is true. A lot don't, particularly the Arab Jews or the Jews from Arab countries are the least likely to have second passports, probably. But Jews who have connections to North America, Canada, Europe, and so on do. So do they talk about this? Is it already happening? Is this departure already happening? What can you tell us from your close observations of discussions within Israeli society?
Yeah. First of all, I should say that up to the 7th of October, there was already clear indications of people relocating themselves and their capital outside of Israel. Not in huge number, but in significant numbers in terms of the quality of the capital that they had and the position that they had in the Israeli economic elite. So this is a process that began before the 7th of October. In a way, the 7th of October stopped for a while in the name of, a kind of instinctive unity in reaction to the 7th of October, but it is resuming. So it is happening. I think that there are two kinds of conversations in Israel that are taking place. There's one but both conversations have something in common. And the common thing is that it's clear that the next 50 years, the only promise in the horizon that Israeli politicians and leaders have for Israelis is continued bloodshed and wars. This is very clear. And you hear it also from Israelis who support the war and probably don't have the passports to go out. They understand that Israel in the next 50 years is a state that at best defeats, if you want, its enemies, but is all the time constantly a militarized zone. Even if, in a successful scenario, that you manage that. The second, that's one conversation. What can we do? This is our life. Some of them would buy into Netanyahu's idea that this is the lot of Jews because of anti-Semitism and there's nothing you can do. I think there is another conversation which says, is it really the only way to live? Again, I would have loved to say that this has anything to do with compassion towards the Palestinians, realization of the criminality towards the Palestinians. It is not yet. Who knows? Maybe this will come as well. But for the time being, it's just a realistic a view at a situation where, especially after the 7th of October, you say to yourself, so this is my life now. So if I love military life, and some people do, and I love wars, and I love, if I like that kind of existence, yes, maybe I'm in the right place, like Sparta in ancient times. But if at all there is a modicum of desire in me to have what one should call maybe normal life, this is not the place to be in. Again, I even detach it from the Palestinians. It's almost like saying, I've built the state to be a safe haven for Jews all over the world, and it is the most dangerous place for Jews to be in right now. And that's a contradiction you don't easily gloss over.
Yeah.
And the numbers are very clear. So this is not something you fabricate. You can easily, they know it. It's not very safe to be an Israeli Jew. It's the only place where it's not really safe. They are exaggerating anti-Semitism elsewhere. Jews are not killed, are not being attacked, apart from very small individual numbers, because they are part of an alien, oppressive colonialist presence in the midst of the Arab world. They have created insecurity for them, which unfortunately also radiates and projects on some Jewish communities in the world as well.
And yet Biden himself has said that there is no safe place but Israel for Jews all over the world. I mean,
well, Biden has said so many things. He said he's a Zionist president. Right. Like we can tell him that the World Zionist Congress is looking for a new president.
Fit right in. Yeah.
I mean, what American politicians have said since the 7th of October, especially Secretary of State and the president, really, I mean, this is beyond anything we're used to. I just finished a book which will come out in the end of the month called Lobbying for Zionism on Two Sides of the Atlantic, examining the history of lobbying for Zionism, both in Britain and the United States. And there were such moments of pathetic expressions by American leaders, but I think nothing comes close to what we've heard from American leadership since the 7th of October, especially in the first 2 months.
I wanted to quickly ask you about, I mean, you were talking about Israelis leaving and escaping what they don't, this fantasy that was never realized, obviously, as a settler colony. But what do you think are the prospects of the settlers, who have been evacuated from the kibbutzes around Gaza and also in the north of historic Palestine? Do you think they'll ever go back? Where do you think the maps will be redrawn once this is over?
Yeah, very difficult to say. I mean, some of the people in the envelope area are coming from development towns, so they don't have that many options to live elsewhere. So I think they will return. The members of the kibbutzim, I think some of them will not. The north is a big question. As far as they're concerned, unless Israel occupies south of Lebanon, they're not going back. So the Israeli government is really a huge challenge there. It just adds to the other challenges. But you have to remember that the main problem is not so much how the map would look like. I think there's a much more fundamental problem for Israel. The government is not functioning. There's no government. It doesn't function. The only services the only effective service Israeli Jews receive are from the civil society. I mean, it is a civil society that is, experienced in situations of war and emergencies, and therefore it reacts and was able to provide, food, housing, and so on, which the government should have done. But the government is not functioning. It has a lot to do with the personality of the prime minister, but not only. So I think that no less important is not only the question whether they will return or not, whether Israel would return to what it used to be, at least an effective state, at least as far as its Jewish citizens were concerned. We are now nearly half a year since the 7th of October, and there's no indication for it. And we know how Israeli electoral system works with a coalition government and so on. So even if there is a group of politicians, let's say, that are a bit more competent and would enable to reignite or reactivate the state systems and ministries, they would rely in a coalition of people who are either messianic or are totally incompetent. And therefore, it all adds to this picture, which I think that quite a few Israeli Jews would agree with me, not many, but more than ever before, that this is not working. This is not working. I mean, I would like to explain to them that it's not working because originally you cannot impose yourself on a different country and take it over and be an alien in an area. But they haven't reached that level of analysis. But they're just looking at the reality and it's not working, and they can't see where the alternative for it will come. The total reliance on the United States is suddenly hit them in the face. I mean, the biggest worry in Israel is from every time Netanyahu opens his mouth criticizing Biden, many Israelis fear that he doesn't realize that without the United States, militarily and economically, Israel is not sustainable. I don't think we ever were in that situation. If history teaches us anything, these kinds of processes begin very slow, but then they accumulate speed and then they become very dramatic and monumental, as happened in the Soviet Union, in South Africa and other places of South Vietnam around the world.
It's really a very far cry, Ilan, from the image of Israel that I remember growing up with in the 1980s, which is, even if we saw Israel as a usurper state, as an aggressor, as an occupier, there was a certain sense that Israel was strong, competent, that even if it had a lot of support from the United States, that it was very capable, and that Israel could do anything. And it's remarkable how totally that has unraveled, and Israel looks as dysfunctional as any state in the region that you could point to, or any state in the world for that matter. And the image of the brave, courageous, capable Israeli soldier has completely collapsed into these. Not to say the brutality wasn't there, of course it was, as your own work has documented the massacres and the brutality from the very beginning. But nonetheless, there was this idea of the capable and brave Israeli soldier, the raid at Entebbe, the heroism and so on, the Mossad, the long arm of the Mossad, which could reach anyone, anywhere in the world at any time. Now they look like thuggish, brutal clowns, and they don't scare anyone. They horrify and disgust, but they don't inspire awe and fear in the way that they did. Do Israelis have a sense of this change? Do they understand? Do they see this change in their image and understand it?
It's interesting. I think it's kind of a mixed picture. On the one hand, they say to themselves, and I read it in many and talked with people there, saying, imagine what would have happened if Hezbollah would have coordinated with Hamas a joint attack on Israel on the 7th of October. how would Israel would have fared. And we're still talking about two guerrilla armies, not two conventional armies, armies without aeroplanes, tanks, and proper artillery. So on the one hand, there is this idea that Israel is not invincible, that it doesn't function. On the other hand, they're trying to create a new story of heroism under the fog that we all don't know exactly what happened on the 7th of October. So they begin to build these stories of heroism on the day itself, and of course, heroism in Gaza, and so on. So they're trying to rebuild this image of a heroic, competent army. I don't think it sticks. I don't think it holds water. So I think they are aware of it. Again, it's the kind of thing that you have to remember, that it's this reality is being faced by people who generation after generation were indoctrinated in a certain way. It becomes kind of part of their DNA, if you want, or mentality, as they call it in Arabic, aqliya, that anything like this is due to anti-Semitism, due to the fact that everybody hates us, nothing to do with what we're doing, and so on. It may still work with some Israeli Jews, this idea that, this is a terrible period. We have nothing to do with it. It's done to us because that's the lot of Jews throughout history. I think that some of them begin to doubt whether this is effective. I remember people were totally surprised when I talked to audiences. I remember in Australia and other places, they really don't believe it, but recently the BBC even admitted this, is most of the Israelis consume news only from the Israeli media. They really have not seen one, you have to remember that, they have not seen one picture from Gaza that tells you about the suffering of the people of Gaza. Not one picture in the last 6 months. And I know that they can have access to other alternative media, or even the mainstream media in the West is enough to give you some indication, but they don't know, and they don't want to know, and even if they know, the dehumanization is such a level that it doesn't. So it's a complex situation where one of the things we should, and I think it's up to us, the anti-Zionist Jews who were born in Israel, to work on this. And this should not trouble the Palestinians. It's not the Palestinian problem. But I think it's up to us to tell them that there is an alternative. That there is an alternative. It's very difficult because they are so brutal now, but there's still millions of people, and not all of them were born, criminals and heartless and so on. There is an alternative. You've written about the one-state solution. I've written about the one-state solution. We did not imagine a Judenreich state. We didn't say that these states would have no Jews in them. We just talked about a state of a liberated, decolonized, and based on equality. Because I'm part of the one-state democratic initiative in Israel, and the initial reaction was, let's not talk about it now. It's not the time. I'm not sure about it anymore. At first I agreed because, we all wanted to focus on how to stop the genocide. I still think that talking about a horizon, which is different from the one we're seeing here, is something that is worth talking about. But as we said at the beginning of the conversation, the process of deprogramming Israeli Jews, or waiting for them to wake up or understand, maybe with the distance of time and so on, is not a precondition for the liberation of Palestine. It's not a precondition. Yeah.
Ilan, that's something I would love to hear about in the future as you make those points. Would love for you to come back and talk about the reactions. It's so fascinating for us. One thing I'll say, when you talked about how Israelis only see Israeli media, another phenomenon I've noticed is it seems they think nobody else sees Israeli media, that
Right.
that what they say in Hebrew is like a private conversation only among Israelis, and that's why it's such a rich source for us. A lot of the reporting we do is simply translating what comes from Israeli media, because
Absolutely.
they're so much more honest with each other.
Mhm.
That you know, they think no one else, that Hebrew is a secret language no one else can decipher.
Yeah.
So it's a terribly useful source for us. Just we just have a couple of minutes. I have one question for you, and I think Nora has one. Maybe since I'm speaking, I'll go first. Ilan, you were born in Haifa in Palestine to German Jewish parents, if I'm correct.
That's right.
What would you say now? What do you say now to the German people and the leaders of Germany?
Yeah, this is a very important topic for me. In one sentence, almost like a soundbite, but I will explain it in two more sentences after that. I would say that Germany was once on the wrong side of history, and I don't know why it insists to be once more on the wrong side of history. And what I mean by this, of course, you understand what I mean by this, but I would just to make sure that everybody understands what I'm talking about it. I think that the fact that the Germans think that they absolve themselves from what has been done by the Nazi Germans in the Second World War by supporting unconditionally and without any inhibitions the colonization of Palestine and the present genocide, they are abusing the Holocaust memory. They are not compensating for what they have done, but rather they are leaving it as an open wound rather than allow it to be healed. And the second point, I would say that I'm really surprised. I speak German, so as you say that Hebrew is not a secret language, German is not a secret language to me. And I cannot understand how intelligent people, educated people, coming from a society that has a lot to contribute and had contributed to civilization, how these intellectuals and educated people appear to be so stupid and superficial in the way that they express themselves when it comes to the question of Israel and Palestine in general, and especially to the situation that unfolds in front of our eyes now. It's quite painful to see people parroting the Israeli narrative. Either they know that they are doing it on purpose because they think it serves Germany or whatever, or they are really totally blinded and ignorant because of the way the German intellectual elite developed vis-a-vis the question of Palestine. But we should say large sections of the young German society, in the civil society, and we should remember it, demonstrate in their thousands every week for Palestine. Young students and young faculty members really courageously face a German academic establishment that threatens to throw them out and suspend them, and nonetheless they continue to do this. We have to remember that Germany has one of the largest Palestinian community in the West. So I would not lose hope for the German society, but the present as political establishment, cultural intellectual establishment is really it's a shameful chapter in Germany's history that is meant to compensate for another shameful chapter, but is doing exactly the opposite.
We just have literally a minute left, Ilan, but finally, what gives you hope these days in these very dark and relentless times?
Well, I have a Center for Palestine Studies in the University of Exeter, which has about 40 Palestinian postgraduates or people working on Palestine. And through them, I can see the networking to other young Palestinians and pro-Palestinians around the world, especially the young people. They give me a lot of hope. They have a clear vision for the future. They have a huge amount of energy and levels of commitment. And I think that they have the power to lead us into a different future. And with the kind of processes I described before in our conversation, I really think that in the medium run, not the long run even, we will see the beginning of a different kind of reality. Our greatest fear is for the next year, 2 years, and 3 years. But if we can somehow survive it and do what we can to tame it, I think we are into a much better chapter in the history of modern Palestine.
Dr. Ilan Pappé, you are a legendary historian, writer, activist, scholar, and friend and contributor to the Electronic Intifada. We are very, very grateful for all the work that you have done over the decades and continue to do. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
Thank you so
Ilan.
much. Thank you, Ali.
Hope to have
and
you
Nora.
again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Inshallah, of course. I would
Absolutely.
love to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you, Ali, for coordinating that interview. That just he's
I mean, Ilan is someone who, as I said, I consider a friend, and I've known for many, many years. And he was so far ahead of many people on a lot of issues in terms of understanding, explaining what Israel is and what it would become. And he's, as he said to us, he's giving us brutal honesty when he says he doesn't think things are going to improve in the short term. But the fact that somebody who is so rooted in the reality and the utter horror of what we're seeing still has hope for the future is something that is important, something to hold close.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. You are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah. And we're going to turn now to our next guest, Dr. Ben Thomson. Ben has been volunteering in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip since 2013. He recently returned from Gaza. He worked as a medic during the Great March of Return in 2018, when Israel deployed snipers to murder and maim thousands of unarmed civilians protesting the siege of Gaza and demanding their right to return home. He's also taught annually at the Islamic University of Gaza, now destroyed by Israeli bombing, but he helped develop multiple medical education programs there. And he was suspended from his job in Toronto last October after calling out a Canadian Israel lobby group for dehumanizing and inaccurate comments about Palestinians. Dr. Ben Thomson, thank you so much for spending time with us on the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really humbled to be on immediately after the brilliant historian, Dr. Pappé. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do we even begin? Talk about your most recent trip to Gaza. As I said, you've been going to Palestine over the last 10 years. What was different this time, and what were you doing there now?
Yeah, so Nora, I've been, like you mentioned, I've been going since 2013, but I was actually there in September 2023. So I had a really good sense of what was happening immediately before October. And of course, having read the news, as all of us have, having lost friends, loved ones in Gaza over the last several months, and myself being a humanitarian, I've extensively studied the situation on the ground and heard daily from my friends and humanitarian aid workers who were there. So I expected to see a humanitarian emergency. I expected to see a humanitarian disaster. I had read about genocide. I had not seen it with my eyes before. Certainly, I've been to Gaza during bombings before, but this was something completely different. It was beyond my worst expectations. And despite the horror that I saw, I'm actually quite hopeful that at some point Gaza will develop a healthcare system by Palestinians for Palestinians, because every day I was there, I met another amazing physician or an amazing patient who, despite everything that they've suffered, is just showing outstanding resilience.
And you're a specialist, you're a nephrologist.
Mhm.
And
A kidney doctor.
yeah, kidney doctor, right?
That's right. That's right.
And I mean, what is it like? I mean, just the logistics of
Yeah.
specialty care at this time. You know, how are you able to diagnose, let alone
Yeah.
treat chronic illnesses or diseases at a time when specialists are being murdered, equipment is
Yeah.
being destroyed, and basic diagnostic tools and equipment are simply unavailable?
You know, I think of one girl that I saw in Gaza. As a kidney doctor, I don't usually see children. Most of my practice in Canada is only with adults. But given the very limited access to subspecialty care that predated October in Gaza, that's been a problem that's been a long time. You know, just as an example, prior to October 2023, there were 2 board certified kidney doctors to manage over 2 million people in Gaza. Just to give you a comparison, in a city like Toronto or a Canadian or North American center with a similar population, you would expect to have about 20 to 30 subspecialists for that population. So they already had a fraction of what was needed. And Dr. Hammam Allo, a very young but incredibly talented nephrologist, was killed in his house with his father and father-in-law. The head of internal medicine, who also himself did some subspecialty nephrology or kidney medicine care, Dr. Rafat Labad, he was killed. And one of the other doctors who was doing kidney care, Dr. Abdullah, who was in fact running the Shifa hospital. The Shifa hospital, of course, has been bombed, and we've all seen what's happened to the Shifa hospital over the last few days. They simply can't provide care, either because they themselves have been killed or the resources to provide care don't exist. And if I go to that 18-month-old girl that I saw, it's quite a revealing case. You know, Reem came in with her mom in one of the primary care clinics that I was working in just about a week ago in Rafah. And I was able to establish that her spleen and her liver were both much larger than I would have expected. I could feel lymph nodes. There really wasn't blood work available, but the very, very limited blood work that we had access to suggested that she probably had cancer. And we were worried that she probably had lymphoma. Now, typically we diagnose that by doing a biopsy and to sending it to a specialist doctor who would look at it under a microscope and establish the diagnosis. We would typically do that after doing a CAT scan or an MRI or some type of imaging to identify, you know, whether this cancer had spread, for example. Unfortunately, prior to October, there were 3 MRI machines in Gaza. All of those have been bombed or destroyed and are no longer functional. Of the 5 CT scanners that were present in September 2023, 4 have been destroyed, and one of them is awaiting a part to be delivered once Israel provides permission for that to be delivered. So we can't do imaging. It also happens that the lab that would read a biopsy has also been bombed. So they basically can't read biopsies. And the 2 pathologists that would read that biopsy, even if we have a lab, both of them have been killed. So there is essentially no mechanism to diagnose cancer in a way that we could start treatment for this 18-month-old girl. Even if we could diagnose it in September, where did children with cancer get treatment? At Rantizi Hospital in Gaza City. Well, that's been bombed. So there's literally no capacity to provide this 18-month-old girl care. And so we had no choice but to demand through initially the WHO that approved it. And then subsequently, the second step is to get approval from Israel to leave Gaza. And to leave Gaza for perhaps going to Jordan or Qatar or some other location that might be able to provide this young girl care. Unfortunately, only 1 in 2 of the requests for leaving Gaza are approved for females, and it's about 1 in 3 for males. So you can see there's a huge amount of morbidity and death related to the destruction of the healthcare system. And, traditionally, when we think about, the over 30,000 people who have been killed in Gaza, we traditionally think about it as far as bombs, explosions. That's the typical way we think about it. But we forget about the fact that people like Reem, young children like Reem, who have these new diagnoses that are completely survivable if they were in a healthcare system from September 2023 that hadn't been completely targeted and decimated, we forget that she's also a casualty of this genocide.
And this is on top of 17 years of a blockade that has now been effectively normalized. Like, I just hearing that there was, one MRI machine for 2.3 million people, that has been normalized. And I mean, what capacity did specialists like yourself have in Gaza during this, this 17 years of blockade until October? And how do you see it? I mean, it's just kind of unfathomable to think that those were the good old days now in terms of medical care.
It's a really good question. So in 2013, I did my first visit in Gaza, and at that time, I was doing a needs assessment for internal medicine and kidney medicine. So I visited most of the health facilities throughout Gaza at that time. And at the end, I had to create a report that was provided to the health authorities, essentially so they could target investment to determine how best to improve those programs. Now, the very first recommendation that was suggested by the team of doctors that did this assessment was that if the occupation and siege didn't exist, there would have been no need to do the assessment in the first place. And I think that's so true of so many of the interventions that take place in Gaza. So many of the NGOs are there doing work that would be completely unnecessary if the Palestinians were given the freedom without illegal occupation to create their own health systems. You've mentioned the topic of subspecialist physicians, and it's a really important topic. One of the things that I identified on that first visit is that you have over 2 million people and one cardiologist, one heart doctor. You have, at that time, one kidney doctor. And that's impossible. Like, that's simply impossible to provide adequate care. And why does that exist? Well, it exists because those very determined, heroic physicians in Gaza, they want to learn. They want to develop their own programs to teach other physicians. But part of that requires them to leave Gaza and to go to international centers of training. And overwhelmingly, they have almost no opportunities to do that. And oftentimes their applications to do so are rejected by Israel. So instead, they rely heavily on international groups coming in and doing that training. But you can imagine how difficult that is, because often those applications are also rejected. So, I initiated a charity in 2013 that was focused specifically on enhancing medical education in the occupied territories of Palestine, which include, of course, West Bank and Gaza. And we've had significant challenges. The overwhelming majority of the people we've trained have been in West Bank, simply because it's almost impossible to get in and out of Gaza. And that problem won't change unless the occupation is abolished.
Yeah. Ben, you were as you've told us, you were just in Gaza. Describe to us a day in Gaza, just what you wake up to, what you see, what's it like around you? What's it like trying to work and to heal people in this situation? And talk about where you were exactly in Gaza, if you can.
Absolutely. So I was part of a group that was evaluating non-communicable diseases. So this means things like diabetes, blood pressure, cancer care, dialysis care. And as part of that evaluation, I was located predominantly in the southern part of Gaza, in Rafah and Khan Yunis. We did do a site visit as well to Al-Aqsa Hospital, which is at that point was the hospital the farthest north that we were permitted to go, admittedly with quite heightened security protocols to do so. The average day of most people in Gaza is 24-hour around the clock drones. So every moment of the day, you hear the drones above. Every night, your sleep is interrupted by explosions. I didn't get one night where I wasn't woken up by bombings. And that's a way of life now for everyone, for the majority of people in Gaza who are now in the south. In addition to that, I think it should be stated that the majority of people in Gaza have access to such limited water that it's under 20% of what would be considered the international standard of 15 liters. Most people now have less than 3 liters a day. And the people who are living in the tent cities in Rafah, they have one toilet for every 800 to 1,000 people, limited access to water. They're lucky to get one meal a day, and oftentimes get no meals a day. When we went in,
we actually have some pictures you shared with us. I don't know if you can see that, but feel free to talk about some of these pictures and what they show.
Yeah, so the picture you're seeing there is in the Mawazi tent city camp. And what you see there is essentially a block. It looks like a block of cement, but it's actually a toilet. There's a hole in the middle. And that serves about 800 to 1,000 people. There's one of those blocks for about every 800 people. You can also see that there's no door, so there's absolutely no privacy, and there's no lights. So what we found when we visited this tent city was that while people were using this at night, you can imagine that's not accessible to people with physical disabilities. It's not safe for people to use at night because they simply can't see. There's no privacy or dignity with using it. So what had materialized is that a lot of the people living in that area were able to walk down to the beach, despite the fact that raw sewage is now being left to drain directly into the ocean. People are using the ocean to bathe. That has dramatically increased the risk of diarrheal illness and skin infections. There isn't access to water except for water trucks, which is limited to about 2 to 3 liters a day, which people have to use for everything. Food preparation, bathing, cleaning their clothes, everything. It's simply not enough. So people are barely living, they're barely surviving. Limited food, limited water, no hygiene. It's an absolute disgrace to humanity that this is allowed to happen, because the entire world has known about this for months and months and months. What you see here in this pictures is a number of tents that have been built immediately adjacent to the Israeli border. And children who live in this area will often walk up to the fence and try talking to the Egyptian guards. And this is
next to the Egyptian border.
Correct. This one is immediately adjacent to the Rafah border. In response to this, and under the concern that some people from Gaza would escape, so to speak, to Egypt, Egypt since October has reinstituted a second set of fences immediately after this set of fences that you can see in this photograph here. Again, further disconnecting Gaza from the rest of the world. And so what you see here in this photograph, this is a photograph in the Rafah area where there are massive numbers of tents. We talked about the lack of sanitation and hygiene, the very high rates of infectious diseases. What you see here is a graveyard. And so previously there were 3 graveyards in Rafah, but the massive death toll of over 30,000 people, there simply wasn't anywhere left to bury them. Initially, this was confronted by trying to dig up some of the graves in which family members could also be buried in with people who were already buried in the Rafah cemeteries, but that became impossible to continue. Subsequently, this cemetery was built immediately adjacent to some of the tent cities. And what you'll see here is only approximately about 1/3 of the entire size of the cemetery. Sadly, they don't have enough space to bury one person per grave, so they're often burying 3 or 4 family members in the same grave. It's absolutely horrendous. One of the doctors that I know quite well from my previous trips, he used to run a hospital that has actually been bombed in Gaza City. He subsequently moved to Rafah, where he now resides. 3 of his 4 children were killed in an airstrike before he moved south, and they're buried in this graveyard. His wife is also buried in this graveyard in another part of the graveyard, separate from his 3 children. And so people are living amongst this unlivable conditions immediately adjacent to those very people, their loved ones who have been killed. This picture is especially difficult for me because what you see here are they've run out of gravestones. And so what they're using instead is cinder blocks. And the cinder blocks you see there, the smaller ones, I was told, were for children. And you can see here there's a massive number of small cinder blocks representing 1 and often more children who are buried together from the same family. And you can see in the background, this graveyard is immediately adjacent to a very densely populated tent city. This is how people in Gaza are living. They are literally living amongst the dead. And they themselves in conditions which are not compatible with life. It's, as a humanitarian, I've studied the humanitarian principles, right? These are things that are part of our religion, so to speak. We know about humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence. These are our guiding principles. And, as a humanitarian, I'm appalled that what we see here is inhumane. And I find it impossible to be neutral in a situation where literally what we're seeing is genocide. We see here as well in this photograph, this picture was also taken in Rafah, and what you see is a food tent, and you see hundreds of people lining up for the food tent. This is just beside the tent city that I showed you, also in Rafah. There's really 2 reasons why people line up for anything in Gaza right now. One is for food, and one is at banks, where government workers hope that the bank opens and provide them whatever small fraction of salary they're entitled to so that they can support their families. Here is a lineup for food. And if the people in this lineup are lucky, they'll all get 1 meal on that particular day. Many of them will go home with no food. In the city area outside of this photograph, we commonly saw children walking with empty pots, banging the pots, hoping to find food, hoping to find someone who would bring them food, and often, not eating at all. Children in this area were almost all barefoot. We saw in one of the wound clinics hundreds of wounds related to mass displacement, people moving from the north to the south. One case particular is very, memorable to me. It was actually a doctor, a very heroic doctor, who she and her family had been living in northern Gaza. She's a student at the same university I teach at, Islamic University of Gaza. And her family had been displaced not once, not twice, not even 3 times, but 4 times, each time moving from one tent to another tent. And by the time she had her 4th displacement event, she ended up living in a UN shelter in Rafah with her family. Now, her medical school career is completely uncertain. The medical school, both Al-Azhar University and Islamic University, have been bombed, and there is no university courses at the moment. She's only midway through her medical school, so it's completely uncertain what'll happen with her medical studies. But as soon as she arrived in Rafah, she went to a clinic where she's now volunteering full-time in one of the wound clinics there, completely unpaid. And each time I worked with her after clinic, she would ask me to stay to teach her, because she's had essentially no medical school classes. So I would stay for an hour to provide her with some extra teaching. And this to me is heroic. I remember asking her, the question that we all should stop asking in this genocide is, how are you? I've as a Canadian, it's almost ingrained in my DNA. It's our national greeting. But, I asked her this question, and her answer was, I'm alive. My family is with me. All of us are alive. And for that reason, in Gaza, we're very, very lucky. But the fact that she continues to work, she is smiling. She never stops smiling. She's more concerned about her patients. That to me is the story of the Gaza physicians who are heroes, who are still working, the overwhelming majority of whom are unpaid, the overwhelming majority of whom have been displaced and are now working often in unbearable conditions with limited access to medications, limited access to supplies. They're doing an amazing job with the limited resources they have. Those to me are absolutely heroic people.
Yeah. Ben, you also have photos and video that you took of the aid trucks that are just permanently, it seems, blocked by Israel, supported by the U.S. At the crossings. Can you explain what's going on in this video?
Yeah, so the only mechanism now with which non-government organizations or charities enter Gaza is through the southern border, through Rafah. And
which is a pedestrian crossing. It's not meant for
exactly.
industrial commercial trucks, right?
Exactly. And because there's multiple border crossings that Israel could open. We're familiar with, for example, Kerem Shalom crossing, which typically would be used to bring in trucks. There's also some crossings in northern Gaza, in northern Gaza that would normally open to facilitate aid. These have been by and large closed. And Kerem Shalom crossing, we've all seen, for example, the Israeli civilians who in fact blocked aid at that site. So really aid has been limited to Rafah border crossing. This video is on the drive into Rafah through the Sinai Peninsula. There's literally miles and miles and miles of aid trucks that are stopped. And, the delegation of healthcare workers that I came in with included physicians that had been there just 3 weeks prior, and they recognized many of these aid trucks as the same aid trucks that had been there 3 weeks ago. They're not moving. And so, as much as I am delighted that there are attempts to bring aid in non-traditional ways, airdrops are not the way to overcome a famine. They are not sufficient.
And Ben, as we've been saying all along, I mean, these videos, and we are very grateful to you for sharing them with us, because they corroborate what we've been saying and the other reports have been saying. There have also been satellite images showing thousands of trucks lined up, that this famine, this starvation is deliberate, it is engineered, it is on purpose. And so, all the airdrops and the efforts, we're going to talk more about the so-called maritime corridor with Jon coming up. This is all a distraction. This is all to send out the message to people that, oh, look, we're doing everything we can. And it's just PR stunts. The reality is, if the United States and Israel, the two principal powers here, wanted to let those trucks in through Rafah, they would come in, or through Kerem Shalom, or through any of the other crossings. it's in their
Yeah.
hands, but they've made a decision not to allow the aid in, and instead to distract people with these airdrops, which do not, which if anything are harmful, because the reports
Agreed.
I mean, aside from the fact that these things are literally falling on people's heads and killing people, or falling in the sea, or some have fallen in Israel, they're also falling into a situation where there's no orderly distribution,
Mhm.
and it opens people up to being vulnerable to unscrupulous or desperate people who are hoarding the aid or selling it for very high prices and so on. So it's just
Mhm.
crucial that you showed us those videos.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the airdrops are largely performative, to demonstrate a supposed desire to confront a famine, but they're ineffective and essentially harmful. Um, knowing what was contained on those aid trucks, if they were allowed in, that's the mechanism. That's the mechanism. There have been a number of famine reviews published recently, including one as early as last week, and the reviews still say that this famine can be confronted with aid, meaning we can overcome it with aid. So they're still hopeful that, those trucks, if they're let in, we could confront the famine. But those famine reviews do not have a role in airdrops. They're pretty deliberate to say that, if you're going to let 37 trucks in a day and suggest that that's going to overcome this genocide, when we had about 500 trucks coming in per day in September 2023, that's a joke. That's completely inadequate. And I fully agree with your description, Ali. It is fully performative.
Finally, Dr. Ben Thomson, I'll ask you the same question that we asked Ilan Pappé. What gives you hope right now, and what should people outside of Palestine who are watching this with horror, inside and outside the medical community, what should people be doing right now?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer the second question first. What to do, and if you are someone that can go to Gaza and provide on the ground aid as part of one of the emergency medical teams, I recommend you do so. There are inadequate physicians on the ground, or inadequate numbers of physicians on the ground now. The people that are there now working in healthcare are absolutely incredible, but there's just not enough of them. So if you can do that. I also think it's critical, if you're not in the healthcare profession, you need to be calling your members of parliament. You need to be out protesting. You need to be supporting the boycott, divest, and sanction movement. These things are meaningful. They're impactful, and people in Gaza rely on our efforts to push our own governments to make the changes on the ground that matter. So I do think those things matter. With regards to what gives me hope, to be honest, it's the people in Gaza. When you consider the over 70 years of suffering, of the decades of occupation, of not being able to have a right to self-determination, not being able to build their own healthcare system, and yet despite that, what I saw in September and what I saw again in March are people operating with absolute heroism, working for free for 20 hours a day, living in a tent as healthcare professionals, saving lives, doing the best they can. And so even though I saw some absolutely horrendous things that were absolutely inhumane and easily preventable, even though I saw that, I also saw, people in Gaza, what they want is peace. What they want is an end to the illegal occupation. They want freedom. They want the ability for their kids to grow up in a place that has some degree of certainty. And that's what they deserve.
Indeed. Dr. Ben Thomson, you are a nephrologist, specialist, humanitarian, educator. People can go to your social media on Twitter at twitter.com/BenNephrology. Thank you so much for your incredible work and for being with us on the Electronic Intifada live stream. We'd love to have you back on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben Thomson, and I hope that people will heed your call.
Yeah.
And thank you for everything you shared with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah. Thank you so much, Dr. Ben. We're going to turn to Jon now for the latest resistance news from Gaza and the West Bank. Hi, Jon.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Jon.
You're
Great
also
show.
going to take it's so far been amazing, and we're just 2 hours in. No big deal. Jon, you're also going to take a look at the U.S. Army's operation to build a pier in Gaza City and how that plan lines up with Israel's ongoing construction of a bisectional highway south of Gaza City that will divide the strip between the north and the south. What's going on with Gaza?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit last week on the show about the maritime corridor. So I wanted to dig into it a little bit and show people what the Americans have in mind for this maritime corridor. And I just want to say off the top that the Gaza Strip needs more than anything a port. And what we're talking about here is not a port. So this is a pier that the United States Army is intending to build south of the Gaza Strip. This pier is separate from the pier that people might have seen in the news in the north of the Gaza Strip that took the aid shipment off a barge from Cyprus that happened the other day. That is a jetty out in the north that's completely separate from this American project. And this maritime corridor is going to be facilitated by the United States Army. The United States Army has watercraft that will show you here what they look like. It's a significant operation that the Americans are undertaking here. We're looking at some of the vessels that are going to be involved in this project, and there's many of them. That's the mothership there, and you can see the cranes. We're looking at a massive ship there with a number of cranes on it that will be used to create this pier. And so the pier has two components to it. The first component is going to be a floating dock. Here we see the ships. So the two types of ships are logistic support vessels, which you see leading the way there, the larger ship. And then there's in each of these units, there's three landing craft that will be used. And we're looking at footage of the first group that left on March the 9th. And these ships are large, cumbersome ships. They're not sailing ships primarily. And so they take a considerable amount of time to get across the ocean. The first group that left isn't expected to arrive for more than 3 weeks. In this terrible situation that Dr. Ben just ably described of starvation, famine, taking root in the Gaza Strip, we're talking about a project that isn't going to be off the ground for more than 60 days. We're looking here at the pier that they're going to build off the shore from Gaza. This pier can be as much as 2,000 feet long off the shore of Gaza. And then there'll be a second floating dock that's more like 3 miles off the coast. And the large ships will dock at the floating dock and unload the ships that we just saw will unload the gear onto this pier that you're seeing here. So the pier is actually like Legos. It's put together in these pieces and anchored to the ground. It's not a permanent pier, but it is a more solid pier than what the makeshift jetty that's happening in the north is. Maybe we can roll through them one more time too tomorrow, just so people can get a sense of these ships. So these logistic support vessels that we're looking at here, they have the ability to carry tugboats, to carry significant supplies, and then those supplies will be offloaded onto the larger floating dock, and then these smaller ships will take them from the floating dock onto the shore in Gaza. And so I just want to underline the fact that we're talking about 60 days, according to the American armed forces, before this pier is set up. And we're getting reports out of Gaza that Nora ably described in the introduction of catastrophic levels of famine covering the entire population of the Gaza Strip, 100% of the population of the Gaza Strip. And what we're looking at here is going to take 2 months. We're going to be into the middle of May before these ships are set up. And so this American project, we talked about what Israel gains by having this project, besides the pageantry that Dr. Ben and Ali just described. What the benefit for Israel is of this project, and Israel has taken credit for this maritime corridor. Benjamin Netanyahu's government said it was their idea to have this corridor, and they took out on a media tour the defense minister and the head of the Navy and the chief of the Ashdod port, which is the southern port in Israel, took journalists out on the boats and told them on this tour that the maritime corridor is consistent with their blockade of Gaza. So they don't see this as circumventing the blockade. They see it as part of the blockade. The ships will come from Cyprus with an escort, both by Central Command of the United States and by the Israeli Navy. And like I said, the defense minister says that it's consistent with our maritime blockade. And he also said that this pier that the United States Army is building will advance the collapse of Hamas. So Israel believes that they will be effectively undermining UNRWA, the main aid distribution network in the Gaza Strip, but also undermining the private aid networks in the Gaza Strip that have been completely erased over the past 6 months of the genocide that we have been watching. And this corridor is going to rely, according to the Israelis, this is their plan. And just to note, all of these plans seem to hinge on the fact that Israel will win this war and that Hamas won't exist on the ground, and that they can reinvent the aid distribution networks that have existed in Gaza for the past 75 years, which is not clear that that's going to happen, because according to this plan by the Israelis and the Americans, the UAE will be involved in unloading these vessels onshore, because according to the brigadier general who's in charge of this operation, he said, quote, "We will not be onshore." So U.S. troops will not be onshore, but we will be on the pier. So they'll be on the floating dock as well as the pier that ultimately the Legos, as they described them, for those to be attached to the shoreline, somebody's going to have to be on shore to receive this pier and set it up. So this idea of no boots on the ground, like Joe Biden said during the State of the Union, it's not totally clear how the pier is going to be attached without boots on the ground. In any case, that sounds a little bit like splitting hairs of your definition of on the ground, because, of course, with a sandy shoreline and a beach, where boots on the ground begins and where the pier ends is very uncertain. So we have a little bit of linguistic gymnastics happening here. But what we're seeing is a pier being built by the United States Army. The operation has departed, and so the American military has its mission, which to me doesn't seem to be beneficial for the Israelis. And I think that overall, we're looking at something that just shows the humiliation of the American forces and the Americans in general, politically, diplomatically, economically, because while they're working on this pier, this maritime corridor, of course, as we know, the United States has carried out historic air bridge to the Israelis, multiple planes a day and ships every 3 days unloading weapons that have been used in the Gaza Strip to carry out the massacres that are happening daily, the massacres of aid workers that have made delivering aid in many cases impossible in the Gaza Strip, are manufactured by the Israelis using starvation as a weapon of war. The barge that arrived from Cyprus last week unloaded 12 trucks worth of aid. The Israeli border, the land borders, there's 7 crossings that are only 2 of them are operable right now, but there's 7 land crossings that trucks could enter. As Dr. Ben just described, there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of trucks lined up on the border that could come in immediately. Even under this architecture of siege as a weapon of war, starvation as a weapon of war, the Israelis say that their military can process 45 trucks an hour across the border, which of course they could do a lot more than that by increasing staffing or increasing the amount of time that the borders open. But even just using that Israeli number of 45 trucks, the barge unloaded 12 trucks. And so we're looking at a game that's being played here while the entire world is watching the population in Gaza starve. And so it's not clear. We're going to continue to follow this here. We're trying to bring this stuff to you in the moment. And it's not clear from the Americans because the articulation of this plan happened by the United States Army Transportation Expeditionary Brigade in Fort Eustis, Virginia. They gave a press conference before they left and described these things that I'm describing to you now. But we don't have a lot more information than that about what is happening. But it does correspond with what the Israelis are doing on the ground in the Gaza Strip. The pier is to be set up in southern Gaza City, south of Gaza City, matching up with a corridor that the Israelis call the Netzarim corridor, which is a famous corridor in the Gaza Strip. It's where the Second Intifada really began, when a 12-year-old Palestinian boy named Mohammed al-Dura was on film with his father attempting to shield him from an Israeli massacre that was taking place at demonstrations at that crossing at the Netzarim junction in the Gaza Strip. And as I've said before, a lot of these Israeli movements through the Gaza Strip, almost all of them, take place along axes that pre-existed this war. They existed going back to Israel's beginning of the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the way that Ariel Sharon at the time intended to cut up the Gaza Strip and put civilian infrastructure amid the population of Gaza in order to colonize it, like Dr. Pappé talked about so well at the beginning of this show. In the Gaza Strip, that process that Israel has carried out on a national scale took place on a smaller scale in the Gaza Strip, where the settlements were designed to cut up the population centers, to cut the Gaza Strip in half. And if we could just show this video here, Tamara, that was shown on CNN. CNN showed this video that's based off this Channel 14 report that I talked to you before on this program about, because Israel has been working on building this highway south of Gaza City that will cut across and bisect the Gaza Strip. And along this corridor, which they're going to set up a buffer zone, this Channel 14 report took a journalist along the route and showed them the way that they're cutting this territory. We're looking right now for listeners, we're looking at satellite imagery that clearly shows the highway being cut through the middle of the Gaza Strip. Now we're looking at footage from an Israeli TikTok video of them demolishing the Turkish American hospital that was along that line, along that corridor. And they've destroyed everything along that corridor, which is what this satellite imagery comparing 2023 to 2024 just really clearly shows. And one of the reasons why Israel prevents this kind of satellite imagery over Gaza is because when we do see this kind of satellite imagery, it just becomes so clear what the Israelis are doing. So they're cutting this highway south of the Gaza Strip to cut the Gaza Strip in half. It will become a closed military zone where the Israelis, as they say in this report, it will allow us, the IDF said, allow us to raid throughout enemy territory. So they cut the Gaza Strip in half and then carry out raids to the south into the middle camps area and to the north into the Gaza Strip, as we saw them do in the last 2 days invading Shifa Hospital, that they can carry out these raids through this corridor cut in the territory. Again, we're watching this video loop of them destroying a perfectly good hospital. The IDF said during this Channel 14 story, they said, the Turkish hospital was operating a few weeks ago. Now it's completely destroyed. This is the IDF. We destroyed all the infrastructure that exists here. We opened up the whole area with a very large number of mines. And then the Channel 14 Israeli journalist says, not a single building in the area is undamaged. It seems that all the buildings are bent, maybe even saluting the troops as they pass. So this kind of reporting goes on in Israel. Apparently, they're not reporting on the famine and starvation as a weapon of war. They don't report on the 10,000 plus children who have been killed in the Gaza Strip, but they do take them on these embedded military tours to show them this territory that's being destroyed, which we have shown on this program for the last 6 months. But when you see it from the Israeli cameras and framed in the way that the Israelis are framing it, you can see the way that that this corridor will connect to this pier that the Americans are building. We can see the coastline there in that footage. So the pier will be at the end of this closed military zone, which I don't think has been made clear in other reports. But when you put together these two events, the operation of Israel creating this highway together, maybe we can show the next clip tomorrow. It shows you a map that you can see the way that this will cut the territory. On the top of that map is the north of the Gaza Strip. The Hebrew marking there is marking Gaza City. And then below that corridor is the middle camps area. Further south of the middle camps is Khan Yunis, and then Rafah is down along the border. So the population is still, to this day, as Nora said about the Shifa operation, the Israeli army is still forcing people out of the north, forcing people out of Gaza City. When they used the Shifa operation as an excuse to reinvade, they forced people. The Israelis set out one of their leaflets that shows that grid map of the Gaza Strip, and they showed all the neighborhoods around Shifa Hospital and told people to evacuate to the south. So people that have survived under the most brutal conditions in the north for the last 6 months were being told just in the last 2 days that they had to leave Gaza City. And that footage that we saw in Nora's report, the brutal footage of that one child, who of course represents hundreds of thousands of children who are being put through this every day. I just wanted to bring this to you to show you the way in which the Israeli land corridor that they're going to use, that they intend to use to raid the Gaza Strip, is going to connect to this port, which I think to this pier. It's not a port, to this pier. So I think we can start to see the signs of how it will look in the Israeli mind when they have this project, which I just wanted to show you that using Israeli television reports and that very, very brief CNN report that I think really, if it's great that they showed it, it was less than 2 minutes long, but gives you just a sense of what they don't show and why, 6 months on, we've only seen one small report of what is actually happening in the Gaza Strip. So that's the maritime corridor. connected to the pier that the Israelis will build. And now to get into the resistance report of what the resistance has been doing on the ground. The main areas of fighting, I'll get to Khan Yunis in a bit, but the main areas that we've seen footage from the resistance this past week is along that corridor. So it's along that area where the Israelis are working, because by and large, they've pulled out of the north. They're not in any built up areas in the north. They're along the buffer zone. But they have been working on this bisectional highway across the Gaza Strip. And so the resistance videos from this week are actually along this corridor. So maybe we can go to the first one tomorrow. This is from Zahra. This is in the northwest of the middle camps area. And we're seeing a fighter here emerge from an attack tunnel within, I don't know what that is, 50 or 100 feet from an Israeli armored personnel carrier that has 12 troops inside of it. And we're seeing this footage. The fighter emerges from the tunnel and fires between two trees with a direct hit on the Israeli troop carrier here. And you can see with the angle of that firing of the Yasin 105, the tandem charged anti-tank weapon that the Palestinian resistance has put into the hands of all of their fighters. And still 6 months on, we don't see any indication that these 5 months of ground war, any indication that these weapons are running, that these weapons caches for the Palestinian resistance are depleted in any way. They're still able to, and they're still able to reach the Israeli army in this intimate way within a few hundred feet of their vehicles, which are touted as having touted as having active protection systems, which is a weapon on board, which radar detects the incoming round and fires out a defensive round that will defeat the incoming warhead. And we can see from this footage right here that the radar is not picking up the fighter as he emerges from the tunnel and fires between those trees and retreats back into the tunnel and returns to his base. These are not martyrdom missions. These are skilled fighters executing on the ground an operation and returning through their tunnel back to their bases and reporting on the field reports. And so this is, again, in Zahra, this is in the northwest of the middle camps, attacking the corridor on the northwest side, on the seaport side. And maybe we can go to the next one tomorrow. This is another tunnel operation. You can see the fighters emerging from the tunnels. We've taken out the audio to try to keep these videos on air, but the fighters are talking to each other. There's multiple fighters coming out this tunnel hole and surveying the landscape. We're watching footage right now where the fighter is below the grass line. We're looking up at the grass from this position. You can see him move up and down through the tunnel. And he's going to emerge here just as an Israeli armored personnel carrier pulls up close enough to the shooter that you can make out the markings on the armored vehicle and hits the armored vehicle directly. Again, no active protection system being enabled here. And clearly, this armored vehicle is defeated by this footage. There's no doubt that's a direct hit on that armored personnel carrier with 12 troops involved. And again, what we're seeing here as attack tunnels still being used by the Palestinian resistance throughout the Gaza Strip. We haven't seen footage from this area of Gaza before, at least the resistance calling it this area northwest of Zahra in the middle camps. We haven't seen footage specifically from this area before. And we're seeing fighters emerge from their tunnels. And we know Abu Obaida, the spokesperson for the Qassam brigades, has talked about his fighters being in position for months waiting for these operations. And the fighters themselves have spoken on camera about their preparations for these fights and how they're ready in the areas that the Israelis have evacuated civilians from to battle. And this is an open field that we're watching here, with the resistance able to fire their Yasin 105s developed in the Gaza Strip at the Israeli armored vehicles from very close distance. And this clip begins with gunfire. So this APC, this armored personnel carrier, is emerging, firing on Palestinian positions, but not seeing these fighters emerge from a tunnel. Part of the Israelis say now that there's some 500 miles of tunnels under the Gaza Strip. But of course, and we'll talk more about that in the Khan Yunis section, they have no idea. It's clear the Israelis have no idea. They have no on-the-ground intelligence at all from the Gaza Strip, which is something that maybe we'll talk about on a future show, the way that the Palestinians have prepared the landscape and removed the intelligence capabilities from the Israelis. So if we go to this next one tomorrow, this is actually the same tunnel. These are fighters using the same tunnel. So clearly they were able to hit that first armored personnel carrier, retreat back into the tunnel to their base, and then emerge again from the same tunnel and target an Israeli troop carrier. I want to point out on this one, if we watch it when we go back around, this is the two previous troop carriers were not moving. They were stopped when they were hit. If you look at this one, look at the dust flying behind this armored personnel carrier. It's moving at a significant rate of speed along this corridor. The fighter emerges from a tunnel and direct hits. You can clearly see, again, active protection system. The radar is not picking up the round coming out of the tunnel, and hits this armored personnel carrier, which has a top speed of 80 kilometers an hour. It's difficult with these tight crops of this �2 videos to see just how fast that tank is, that armored personnel carrier is traveling. But it can travel up to 80 kilometers an hour, and it sure looks like that's what he's trying to do. The Israeli troops get through this area as fast as they can, and just a remarkable shot by the Palestinians, just clearly hitting that troop carrier at significant speed. And it's unclear from this footage from the fighters how long they're in this position for, but you can see them leave through the tunnel again. And if you look at the landscape around this, they're again peeking out of the grass. It's not clear to me that the Israelis will find that tunnel at all. So this is because they'd have to dismount and come into this entire area, which we're looking at is a few hundred feet. This one's further. This last video that we're watching is further distance away from this traveling armored personnel carrier than the other two videos. But to me, that looks like a tunnel that will still remain, because the Israelis would have the engineering project necessary to clear that territory. It doesn't appear to me that's something that the Israelis are interested in doing at this point in the battle. So maybe we can go to the next one after we watch this hit here. Okay, yeah, let's go to this one, because this is 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐿. This is Islamic Jihad footage from this. This is from Street 10, and the Palestinians call the street above Netzarim Junction Street 10. And so this is now the north side of the corridor. The previous ones were on the northwest from the middle camp, so on the southern side of the corridor. This is now on the northern, on the Gaza City side, attacking the southwest of street number 10. And one of the things about the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐿, the Islamic Jihad fighters, is their videos, they follow the fighters for a little bit longer. And so we can see the fighters moving from the built-up area out into the corridor to attack a troop carrier. And just something interesting to note in this one, we can see that these fighters, as they move through, you can watch them as they move through the landscape here. You can see that the fighter is Islamic Jihad fighter is firing a Yasin 105, which is a Qassam Brigade's weapon that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐿 is using in this operation, which again further shows no indications of these stocks being depleted at all. In fact, Qassam is now sharing this weapon throughout the resistance, and this gives you a chance to follow how long. If you can see there that you can see the Yasin 105 there as well. Islamic Jihad has put a band, a wrap around the barrel to show that it's an Islamic Jihad fighter using a Qassam Brigade's weapon there. So that's the resistance this week. These videos are along the corridor through Gaza, that's cutting Gaza in half south of Gaza City. And as we've described before, and as has been true for many decades in the Palestinian arena, anywhere Israeli troops are present and in any form, there's resistance on the ground. And so in this case, the Israeli army is attempting to cut a corridor through the Gaza Strip, and so the resistance is along that corridor, in the place that the Israelis are present. And maybe after we just watch this shot here tomorrow, we can flip to Khan Yunis, because there's been a significant battle going on in Khan Yunis for the last 3.5 months. The Israeli invasion of Khan Yunis began in early December, and they rotated out the division that was fighting in Khan Yunis after their 3-month tour. And the commander of that division said that we did not achieve our objectives. We did not eliminate Hamas. And so that force was rotated out, and a new force was rotated in. And we're going to look here, we can just run through these pretty quickly here, but we're looking at before and after photos of satellite imagery that was released in the last few days from Khan Yunis. And you can see, while Palestinian fighters are emerging from tunnels with remarkable courage and acumen, what we're looking at here from the Israelis is just destruction. They're just erasing Khan Yunis. They weren't able to find any of their captives. They have no intelligence from 3.5 months of destruction in Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is a city of 500,000 people, but before the invasion in December, it was more than 1 million people because of the people that were pushed out of the north into Khan Yunis. So we're looking at pictures here from the north of Khan Yunis, central Khan Yunis, and southern Khan Yunis, and it all looks the same, just completely erased. More than 50% of the buildings have been erased. This is Hamad Town, and this is an area where the Israelis have been fighting. They pulled out in the yesterday. They pulled out. They've been fighting there in Hamad Town. They've been fighting there for 10 days. They began the operation. They fought consistently for 10 days and then reinvaded for a brief period. But this operation began on March the 6th in Hamad Town. And Hamad Town is a Qatari development of towered buildings like you're seeing here. Maybe just go to the previous shot, Tamara. You can see the way the towers, this is a before and after by a Palestinian photojournalist that shows the 40 plus towers in Hamad Town. And below, you can see that they've simply erased those towers. And we haven't gotten any video footage out of the battle in Hamad Town. But I wanted to bring this to you because of what the Israelis said about the battle in Hamad Town. They said that this was the most difficult fighting that they had of the war. They sent their commando brigade, so their special forces, a brigade full of special forces troops that should be their best, that are their best troops in the Israeli army, and fighting this concerted battle in Hamad Town. That they said, this is the commander, this is the chief officer of the commando brigade, Omar Cohen, sorry. And he said, we experienced combat here in Hamad Town, the likes of which we have not seen anywhere else in Gaza. Advanced combat units with clear command structure. So 6 months into the war, the chief officer of the commando brigade is saying, who has fought this particular officer because of the commando units attaching to all the different divisions throughout the Gaza Strip. This commando brigade chief has been fighting in Gaza since November. And actually in the Israeli press, one of the stories about him is that he actually hasn't said to any of the troops' families, hasn't acknowledged their deaths to the families. And his excuse for why he hasn't done that, which is also part of, I think, that the Israelis haven't claimed all those deaths, but also that he said that the reason why he hasn't given condolences to these families is because he has been in Gaza since November. So this is a Special Forces commander who's been in Gaza since November, saying that this is the hardest fighting that they've experienced. And he said that it's clear that Hamas has the ability to manage its force, and that has been evident for the past 9 days of this battle. And so he is clearly understands and articulating the failure of this 6-month brutality. And what we're seeing in these pictures of Khan Yunis are just destruction. This is not any military objective. This is just military vandalism and destruction. And this commando brigade captain also said something that I think is telling. And I'll wrap on here. They said they are fighting stubbornly here over something important to them, and we will find out exactly what that is. They have absolutely no intelligence. The commando brigade operating on the ground in Hamidtown, fighting for 10 days. He said this on the 8th day of the battle. He said they have no idea what they're fighting in Hamidtown for, but he says we'll find out what it is. I will bring to you that they did not find out what it is and pulled out of Hamidtown yesterday, according to the IDF. And so just military vandalism and destruction, starvation, and that image that you're seeing here is what the buildings, because the previous shot showed us what the overhead footage looks like, and you can see that there's some buildings remaining. They've erased almost every building, every tower. We're looking at apartment towers here. And so if they show the next picture tomorrow, that's the ones that are standing. And we're looking at a building where every single apartment building is blown out with tank shells. So the buildings are either erased or they're standing here with massive holes, just destroying these buildings, making the place unlivable, but achieving no military objectives. The only military objective that was achieved in Hamidtown was the Israelis arrested 400 civilians, which they continually do, arrested 400 civilians. And as we know from reporting in Haaretz, that 27 Gaza prisoners have been killed in Israeli prisons. And that's what we know of at this point. So that's the resistance news from Gaza. I want to just do a quick tour through the West Bank here, because there was a significant operation that took place from the Jenin brigades, the most formidable fighting force in the resistance in the West Bank. This operation here, we can take a look at tomorrow, number 9. This is the Jenin brigades carrying out an operation here, and we're looking at a camera on the barrel of this fighter's gun, and we've again taken out the audio, but you can see the gun is going off. This is an ambush that the Palestinian resistance has set up against an Israeli raid into a community nearby. And we see the Palestinian fighters firing on the Israeli force, and luring them into an ambush here. This is just south of Jenin, in the area between Jenin and Nablus, in one of the villages. And now we're seeing here footage with some triangles of the Israeli soldiers coming to the ambush area to get the fighters. And we see this is obviously a camera that skips frames, but we're seeing the resistance videotaping the detonation of an improvised explosive device on the Israeli troops that arrive at the area. So we're seeing a complex ambush here, but we're also seeing video recording of that ambush that was published the next day. So we're seeing now in the West Bank, the resistance turning around resistance videos like in Gaza within 24 hours of a significant operation taking place. So we're starting to see qualitative increases in the resistance in the West Bank. And of course, the brutality in the West Bank, while not on the scale of the Gaza Strip, has been brutal since October 7th. 450 people killed, 5,000 injured during this period of time. 75% of the casualties took place during Israeli night raids. Maybe we can go to the news report after this clip finishes, Tamara, because the Israelis admitted to casualties in this Jenin Brigade's operation that took place. 7 soldiers wounded in the West Bank, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 reported. Attackers opened fire before detonating explosive device near West Bank settlement. So this operation took place amid the settlements and outposts in the West Bank, and that's something that this 𝐓𝐡𝐞 article identifies, is that this operation took place surrounded by Israeli military positions, Israeli military checkpoints, illegal settlement outposts, and the resistance was able to penetrate this area, carry out this operation, and escape from the operation. Later in this 𝐓𝐡𝐞 story, and they've followed it up, that they haven't been able to capture the fighters that executed this operation. And this is just one of just since you last saw me on this show, there's been 138 operations over the past week by the Palestinian resistance in the West Bank, 32 shooting attacks, 13 IEDs, which damaged 7 vehicles. And if we go to this next clip tomorrow, we can see one of the vehicles damaged here. This is in Jenin, and we see a vehicle, an Israeli armored convoy, passing over an improvised explosive device that over the course of the last several months we've seen are getting larger and larger and closer to impacting the Israeli forces. And when this video loops around, you'll see the doors literally blown off this armored vehicle that is now calling for support with his light on top, and another Israeli armored vehicle will come into the situation here in Jenin. So these IEDs, that is one of 13 IED attacks against Israel. You can watch here the door blow off as it rolls over this improvised explosive device. Now, improvised explosive devices have existed in the Palestinian resistance going back to the 1990s, but we haven't seen the qualitative use of them like we're seeing in the last few months. The resistance in the West Bank, as I've said every time we talk about this, if this was in isolation in the West Bank, we would be calling this the third intifada. Incidentally, intifadas are the first and second intifada that were in the late 80s and early 2000s were probably more like the fifth and sixth intifadas of the Palestinian resistance to Israeli colonization. But I just wanted to show some West Bank attacks. And just as I wrap up here, just wanted to also show that Hezbollah showed a video, just a short video of all of their, a collection of their attacks from Lebanon here. We can see them targeting Israeli surveillance equipment with precise shots. Now we're seeing their surveillance towers being knocked over with rocket fire. There's been more than 1,200 Hezbollah operations since October 7th. We're seeing multiple rocket launchers here. Now we're seeing anti-tank weapons that we've seen throughout. We're seeing them here launch an Al-Mas top attack anti-tank missile that I've described on this show a number of times. Here we're watching them. We're going to watch them down a drone here. They downed a Hermes 450 Israeli armed drone was downed. And this is a video of Burkhan rockets, their largest payload rockets being fired with precision here onto Israeli targets. And this is in a video where Nasrallah says at the end of this video, if you escalate, we escalate. So monitoring the situation along the northern border as well. So that is the resistance report from the Gaza Strip, from the south of the Gaza Strip, from the middle camps of the Gaza Strip, from the north of the Gaza Strip, from the West Bank, from Lebanon. And there's no time to talk about the resistance of Ansar Allah, but that is carrying on also qualitative increases. So lots to report. Sorry the show's so long, but we had 2 excellent guests that was wonderful to listen to. So it's good to see everybody here.
Thanks so much for that, Jon.
Jon, that was absolutely outstanding. It really was. And thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who is still with us. I mean, people are watching, and I'm sitting here glued to it, and I think everyone else is. So we still have just a couple more things we want to talk about with people. So if you're still up, or if you're still with us, that's great, because we've got a little bit more. But I wanted to just show something, if I could, Jon, related to what you just showed us. This is a picture of Hamad town, or Hamad City, as you showed us, that was taken by a friend of ours. I'm not going to name names, because I didn't say that I would be showing it, but this was taken by a friend of ours, a contributor to the Electronic Intifada, from their apartment in Hamad City, obviously before the war, and they sent it to me just to say, that they'd seen the images of their home of Hamad City destroyed. So this is just a reminder that Hamad City was home to people. They cherished it. And when I said to our friend, I said, don't worry, this will be replaced. What can't be replaced is all the people that we've lost. And they said, yes, that's why it means so much to me, because this place was full of the life and laughter of so many of those people who were killed, including our friend's child who was killed in this genocide. And Hamad City was completed in 2016, and it was built with Qatari funding to provide housing to families whose homes were destroyed in the Israeli massacre of 2014. So it just gives you a sense of, and there were, I think, 1,000 apartments in Hamad City. So it just gives you a sense of the utter barbarism and cruelty and savagery of Israel and its backers, that they just do this again and again to people.
To no military purpose, and essentially admitting that they are defeated in Hamad Town as well. So, and
unconscionable. We had, speaking of barbarians, I know that there was two specific news items that we wanted to address. One was about the World Central Kitchen, and more theatrics, in terms of like what Jon was illustrating for us at the beginning of his segment, which was like these like very tedious, ridiculous ways of trying to get, the equivalent of like 4 or 10 trucks in, while there's thousands of trucks waiting at the crossings. And then we wanted to talk about Jared Kushner. Where should we start? Let's talk about the World Central Kitchen. Asa, I know that you've been looking into that.
Yeah, a little. Just to add quickly to Jon's brilliant overview of what's really been happening there. This temporary pier being built by the US, it was first mentioned, to my knowledge, well, it first came to wide attention anyway with the State of the Union address, obviously. Joe Biden's State of the Union becoming under, increasing pressure from around the world and from his own voter base, really, for a ceasefire. So he decided to put in the latest PR effort, essentially saying that we're going to build this so-called port. And I think, Jon makes a really good point that it's we shouldn't really call it a port. The Jerusalem Post actually said that this was Netanyahu's idea and that he suggested it to Biden in the first place. This is what they reported on. And if tomorrow you could show this video about Biden actually was asked about it and asked about who the security for this so-called port would be put on by, and he said the following. Let's just play this quickly.
I just saw a little bit on television. You said that she's a very talented woman. I didn't quite understand the connection she was making.
Just a question. Do you still support banning TikTok? Would you sign that bill?
If they pass it, I'll sign it.
Mr. President, who is going to provide security for the port you're planning to build to offer aid to Gaza?
The
Is it
Israelis.
going to be the idea?
Are you concerned that
Yeah. So there you go. So
Very clear.
it just seems like it's another part of the occupation infrastructure, essentially. And it's also, we should definitely mention this initiative is being led by a group called the World Central Kitchen. And as our, if you could put the next thing up on screen tomorrow, it is an organization which is run by this celebrity chef whose name is Jose Andres. This was exposed in a Twitter thread by a regular contributor at this stage.
Friend of the show.
Yeah.
Zay Squirrel.
Yeah, and as usual, they unearthed this series of tweets. You know, there was also, you can see here that this is the Jose Andres is the leader of this group, the World Central Kitchen, and there's a whole series of tweets in which he's basically pushing Israeli propaganda narratives. There's another one where he's attacking a Spanish minister, one of the very few European ministers who was actually calling for Netanyahu to be way back last year in October, was actually calling for Netanyahu to be prosecuted in the ICC. And Jose Andres reacted to that. Yeah, we can see the tweet here by saying that, just the usual Israeli propaganda stuff. So this is the person leading the organization, which is supposedly going to be bringing aid through this so-called port.
So basically, Jose Andres, this celebrity chef who runs World Central Kitchen and is now posing as the savior of Gaza by bringing in, maybe a truck's worth of food with all this fanfare by the sea, supported and as far as we know, still supports the Israeli genocide in Gaza, and also parroted the Israeli propaganda against Palestinians and the resistance justifying the genocide. And I think that's such a significant finding, Asa, because, you have to ask, why would Israel allow this one group to do this publicity stunt if they weren't already sure that this group was on their side? Because as we know, like we just saw, aid isn't getting in. All these trucks that are lined up, some for weeks, are not getting in. But they're allowing this boat to do this one stunt and to get all this publicity. And I think it's so important that people know this, because I've seen many well-meaning, many friends saying, oh, I gave money to World Central Kitchen because they genuinely believe sincerely that this is a worthwhile effort. And I think it's so important that people know the reality behind it.
Yeah, and the Israeli defense minister, so-called defense minister, Yoav Gallant, has been reported in the Israeli press as saying that this pier is going to actually help Israel defeat the Palestinian resistance. And this is, of course, this is the same Yoav Gallant who infamously said that they were going to starve Gaza, effectively saying, and that infamously said we're dealing with human animals here. So, if this was a genuine aid effort, then why would he be saying that? It doesn't make any sense. So to me, it looks very much like, that the pier is just the latest facet of the Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip. Most of what I've said just here now is reported in tomorrow's excellent article on this topic. And she put it in, here's the article for listeners. It's called "What's the Real Purpose of Biden's Gaza Port?" And in that article, Tamara writes, the construction of a temporary pier and the dropping of aid packages from the sky are political gestures aimed at maneuvering and establishing political realities on the ground. So you can read more about all that in that article.
Thanks for that, Asa. And let's, I hate to do this to people, but let's turn to Jared Kushner.
Yeah.
It's
this video has been circulating, and I think it's worth watching just very quickly and commenting on it. And this was apparently at an event at Harvard University recently.
Just like a couple days ago. Yeah.
Jared
Is that
Kushner,
something that they're talking about?
Yeah. Jared Kushner, just to remind people, for those who don't know, being the son-in-law of Donald Trump, the husband of Donald Trump's daughter,
Ivanka.
Ivanka Trump. And of course, Jared Kushner played a very key role in the Trump administration as sort of the main person behind the so-called Abraham Accords, normalizing ties between Israel and various U.S.-backed Arab tyrannies.
He's really just to say he was really busy, because at the same time that he was apparently solving the quote Middle East crisis, he was also in charge of the opioid crisis here in this country, and he's been a infamous or famous slumlord.
And he's a property developer, and it's almost certain that he benefited personally from all his deals with the Gulf regimes, because his own businesses were in such financial trouble, and he's probably reaped a lot of investments from them. But in any case, this is what he said about Gaza.
In Israel, I mean, that's the first I've really heard of somebody, aside from President Sisi, suggesting that that the Gazans who are trying to flee the fighting could take refuge in the Negev. Are people in Israel seriously talking about that possibility, about hosting Gazan refugees in what is considered, quote unquote, Israel proper?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean,
but that would be something you would try to work on.
I'm sitting in Miami Beach right now, and I'm looking at this situation, and I'm just thinking, what would I do if I was there? And again, you look at, with Israel, it's a different thing, right? In Syria, when there's refugees, Turkey took them, Europe took them, Jordan took them. For whatever reason, here in Gaza, there's refugees from the fighting, from an offensive attack that was staged from Gaza. Israel's going in to do, a long-term deterrence mission. And it's unfortunate that nobody's taking the refugees. Again, I think that the American government should probably have done a little bit of a better job to find a solution to that. As a broker, I think that there would have been a way. But if that's not a viable option, I think from Israel's perspective, it's just something that should be strongly considered.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the reason they're not, for example, the reason the Egyptians don't want to take the refugees, in addition to, of course, there being the domestic unrest that could result, or the instability that could result, but also there are real fears on the part of Arabs, and I'm sure you talk to a lot of them, who think once Gazans leave Gaza, Netanyahu's never going to let them back in.
Maybe, but I'm not sure there's much left of Gaza at this point. So, if you think about even the construct, like, Gaza was not really a historical precedent, right? It was the result of a war, right? You had tribes that were in different places, but then Gaza became a thing. Egypt, used to run it. And then, over time, you had different governments that came in different ways. So you have another war, usually when wars happen, borders are changed historically over time. And so my sense is I would say, how do we deal with the terror threat that is there so that it cannot be a threat to Israel or to Egypt, right? I think that both sides are spending a fortune on military. I think neither side really wants to have, a terrorist organization enclaved right between them. Gaza's waterfront property. It could be very valuable to, if people would focus on kind of building up, livelihoods. You think about all the money that's gone into this tunnel network and into all the munitions. If that would have gone into education or innovation, what could have been done? And so I think that it's a little bit of an unfortunate situation there, but I think from Israel's perspective, I would do my best to move the people out and then clean it up. But I don't think that Israel has stated that they don't want the people to move back there afterwards.
Well,
just a sentient hemorrhoid, that man.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way to put it. But a couple of things to point out that was very disturbing. But two things. He said, I think Israel should move the people out. So that's open support for ethnic cleansing. And then he talked about the waterfront property being very valuable. And that, a lot of people have commented on that. But I have to say, when I went to Gaza in 2013, and I remember we came in from Rafah and we drove up the coast, and during my stay in Gaza, I went up and down that road a couple of times, and especially in the southern area, Al-Mawasi, where now so many people are, trying to find a shelter. That's the area where the Israeli settlements were. So that land is largely open and undeveloped, and it is beautiful, beautiful open coastline. And I remember the feeling I had when I saw it. I said, oh, if ever the Palestinian Authority types plus Gulf money get their hands on this, they will turn it into a private enclave, and the people of Gaza will be shut out, as has happened, by the way, across the region. In Lebanon, there's almost no private beaches left. In Jordan, there's very little if you go to Aqaba, it's all luxury developments. If you go to the Dead Sea, it's the same thing. That's the model of hyper luxury gentrification for the super rich, while the people don't have access to their own resources. And considering how important the sea is to people in Gaza, even right now, as we heard, people, the only place they can go and bathe is the sea. The only people they can, and throughout the siege, people in Gaza have talked about the sea as their only outlet. It's just so horrifying to have heard those words from Jared Kushner, and then just compare his sort of disgusting, dismissive history of Gaza with what we heard from Ilan Pappé earlier. I just wanted people to see that. And by the way, we don't know if Jared Kushner would come back to the White House if Donald Trump is reelected. It's possible he might. It's possible he might not. But I have to say, there's been no change in policy from Trump to Biden. Obviously, things are worse now with Biden, the worst case scenario, genocide, but also the Biden administration has fully supported the so-called Abraham Accords policy of Jared Kushner. So I think this doesn't just illustrate the thinking of Jared Kushner as an individual, but the vile, racist, and genocidal thinking of the entire American political class.
Yeah, Kushner's just a bit more upfront about it.
Yeah, he's just more honest. Absolutely. Is there anything else we wanted to discuss before we wrap? Let's hear from our audience around the world. Asa.
Okay. Yeah. Right. We had people from Switzerland, South Wales, Brynhound Dark. Good afternoon from Aberystwyth. Germany, Texas, Canada, Portugal, New Jersey, lots more. So many more. I can't do them all. We've already run long. Malaysia. Thank you, everybody, to all our listeners and viewers. Excellent session.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Pappé, Ilan Pappé, brilliant as always. Thank you, everybody, for all your comments.
Yeah, thank you. And let's just encourage people to like and subscribe. Of course, go to our YouTube page, sign up to get notified for our next live stream. We've also been doing a lot of standalone podcasts also up on our YouTube page. I did one last week of a successful divestment action by a city here in the Bay Area in California, and advice from activists and organizers, and even a city council member himself who helped pass the resolution on how people can replicate those actions in their own communities.
That was really inspiring, Nora. I really enjoyed watching that because it was a good news story. I mean, there's not a lot of good news in the middle of a genocide, but seeing how people came together and made that happen it was Hayward, California.
That's right.
Shout out to Hayward, California. So there's a great interview. And again, because a lot of people ask us, what can we do? What can we do in our community? There is an example of people doing this in their community and succeeding.
Exactly. So yeah, go to our website, obviously, at electronicintifada.net. Go to our YouTube page and social media, Instagram, Twitter, everything you can find there.
Can I just say one thing, Nora?
Yeah.
I just want to apologize to some of our viewers because we do encourage people to go to the top left of our website there and sign up for our email list where it says get updates.
Yes.
But due to a technical fault, just the way we had the settings, there are some people who had signed up. They did sign up, but they were not getting our emails. I'm not sure how many. Hopefully it wasn't too many, but we have fixed that now. So if you were wondering, if you signed up and you were wondering, why aren't I getting any emails? You should be getting them now. If you're not, send us an email through the website, through the contact form, and we will try to fix it. But I think it should be working for everyone now.
Perfect. Thanks.
And if you haven't signed up, go do it.
Please do it. That's the best way for us to get in touch with you. And that's it. Thank you, as always, to our extraordinary colleague, producer, and director of this live stream, Tamara Nassar, and Ali, Asa, John. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.